Good evening, everyone. My name's Marta Docherty-Hughes. I'm the member of the House of Commons of the UK Parliament for West Dunbartonshire, which you can see behind me. And I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's APPG, the All-Party Parliamentary Group Blockchain. And this evening's webinar, we have an exciting panel who are going to address us on a range of issues, notably around blockchain governance models. And we're going to be really looking at the decisions to influence the type of governance models that governments, I suppose, should be choosing for blockchain networks and consortium. And we'll explore the different governance models that the blockchain networks and the consortiums can use. And we have representatives today from three different blockchain platforms and their main platforms. Delighted to welcome an R3 Cordia, the IOTA Foundation, and of course Hyperledger, who have very different views on how distributed ledger technology has to be implemented for private networks. We'll also be looking at the governance models in larger consortiums, and we have today, of course, representatives of the biggest consortiums in the cryptocurrency space, and that's Libra Association. And I'm sure this is going to be a lively discussion, and also, I hope, a debate which will inform our future decisions and deliberations on how we implement blockchain technology. Before I go on far too much, as politicians usually do, I'm going to, of course, ask the director of the Innovation Centre, the Big Innovation Centre, Birgitte Andersen, to say a few words before we introduce our speakers. Birgitte, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin, and hello, everybody. We are really looking forward to tonight. I want to say that we are almost moving towards the end of the third year of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Blockchain. So we think we've been in it from the straight beginning. In the beginning, we were more like focusing on the concept of blockchain, like a definition of blockchain, fraud, smart contracts, business models, etc., around blockchain. And then we spent a year looking at use cases of blockchain in different industries, as agriculture, property, and non-government organizations, in retail, etc., in finance. But now today is kind of the first meeting where we are going to be looking into the governance of blockchain. So this is the first meeting of a few meetings where we'll be looking at the high-level problem of governance. And we look today is about network governance. So clearly, it's not about the governing of the firm or the governance of markets, but it's about the governance of the network around the blockchain. So very much about the stakeholder interaction and everything around that in relationship to, as you would look at purpose, ethics, security, trust, sustainability, impact, etc. All those we'll be discussing tonight. And then we will be moving on in the following meetings coming. If you stay tuned in the weeks and months to come, where we'll be looking at governance of data, and also later meetings, we're looking even further into governance of digital assets. But anyway, we're looking very much forward to tonight's meetings, and I will just hand over so we can get the debate started as soon as possible.
Thank you, Birgitte. And indeed, yeah, the next sessions is also going to be very useful if people who've been joining us today come back again to see the next webinar. I'd be really interested to see people's thoughts. And suppose before we just hand over to our first speaker, kind of things we really be looking at today is which are the current blockchain governance models offered by the larger platforms? Can blockchain decentralized governance cope with current corporate governance models? These are the types of questions I hope we're going to be asking ourselves. So first up today, and I'm delighted to welcome Isabelle Corbett, Head of Government Relations at R3, and Isabella's role leads in engagement with the public sector, including regulatory bodies, self-regulatory organisations, central banks and policy makers around the world. And additionally, it leads the deployment of R3's blockchain Corda in the public sector. So Isabella, thank you very much for joining us, and we'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you so much. And I was going to share some slides, but I think probably in the name of time and also visibility, realizing that some people are probably on very small screens, I'll instead just speak through the information, as I think that will be more effective in this format. And I'm always happy to answer follow-up questions and provide the slides that I would have shared on a larger screen. So just to start off, I'm Isabelle Corbett. As you just heard, I head up government relations at R3, And that means I'm really speaking from the perspective of a blockchain company. So R3 started as a consortium of banks. We grew well beyond that quickly and into business more broadly. And out of that consortium came Corda, which is the platform that I'll be speaking about today. So we built Corda as a permission ledger for use in regulated markets. And today it's used much more broadly than that. But that's really what informed the architecture from the beginning. Today, we're an enterprise software company who has built and continues to develop our platform in enterprise and open source versions. So when you look at the key characteristics of Corda, one of them is how we share data. So Corda is permissioned and we share data on a peer-to-peer basis. So what that means is that it provides both privacy and scalability. And you'll also see in the architecture of our platform that based on being used in regulated markets, obviously governance is a key component there. So when you're looking to set up any blockchain, whether that's Corda or another, there are a few key considerations, and governance really should be one of those. Obviously, you want to know who is playing and who is playing what role in the network. So first, you have to look at which roles exist in that network. So you have the architects and engineers. Those are the ones who design and implement the underlying code of the blockchain. You have the operators, so those actually running the network. You have nodes, those are the participants on the network. You may have regulators on the network acting as observer nodes. And then you have developers who are the ones who are actually building the applications. Now, when we talk about governance, there are three key areas. There is governance of the specific network, there is governance of the application, and then there is what you could call governance of the underlying blockchain platform and its development. So I kind of think of those as the three different buckets. Now, governance of a network can involve operators, developers, regulators, external boards, single individuals. You can really structure the governance depending on what the use case is and how you want the network or the application to function. But core to governance is identity. So the idea of being able to assign obligations and liabilities really hinges on being able to assign those to legal entities or individuals. So you very much need to know who is who and what the expectations are on a given solution. You also need settlement finality. So you need to know with certainty that transactions are committed and are irreversible. And Corda accomplishes that by offering peer-to-peer consensus. So that piece is critical for looking at when a transaction is final, how you can know reliably that what has happened will in fact stay true and is resistant or unable to be changed. So that is another key component of Corda, which is why regulated institutions, one of the reasons why regulated institutions like the architecture and kind of input on the architecture to make it what it is today. So it's important when you're picking a blockchain platform that you pick both the right platform and the right network setup to meet your requirements. And those factors include who can participate in it, whether there is anonymity for participants, data confidentiality, security mechanisms, energy requirements, scalability, the list goes on, and of course, governance standards. Now, businesses, particularly those that are publicly traded and or regulated, will need to operate in an environment where actors are known and liabilities are assigned, and they also need a clear contractual framework to comply with their corporate governance. From a business perspective, it's also important that the platform be efficient. Obviously, businesses are looking to use reliable solutions and also not to make their job more difficult and make compliance more expensive. They obviously need both reliability and efficiency. So in Corda, there are two different deployments in the most basic of terms. One is you can use the Corda network. So the Corda network is essentially the global network of Corda nodes. Within that, there are business networks. So within the broader Corda network are smaller business networks, and being on the Corda network does not automatically admit you to the individual business networks. There are permissions for each of those as well. The other option is an entirely private network. So that means the network is separate from the Corda network. It is stood up on its own and it has its own permissions. Each carries with it benefits, and really they are being, I would say they're being chosen really based on input from regulators as well as preferences of those participating in those. Now below the network governance and sometimes separate is the application governance, which is really in a rule book. So you can think of that as something like the rule book for LCH. So when you sign up to clear through LCH, you're agreeing to that rule book, and that rule book may change, but the changes are only made pursuant to the procedure that's in place to do those changes, and you have to get the agreement of the governing body to make those changes. So it's not a stagnant document. It can be changed, and participants can always choose to leave if they don't agree with the change. Although in LCH, you see that doesn't really happen. So in terms of governance, as I said, private networks are governed by the entity setting it up, which could be management or developers, and those determine participant access. The Corda network is overseen by an independent foundation that is representative of those who are on the Corda network, and business networks determine the access to their own network. So again, access to the Corda network, which is the broader network, does not guarantee access to the business networks within it. And of course, the platform itself is managed by R3 with community input, and it's available in open source and enterprise. Now, to the competition point, it is up to the operators of the network and also the applications to ensure fair and open access using objective criteria in accordance with those competition laws. So those same rules that apply in business today apply when you're using a different technology. So in conclusion, I will say, we can't predict the future, and 2020 continues to show us that in painful detail, but we do know that it holds change. Today, we need to innovate for what we do know. So regulations of today should continue to apply, and regulations should be based on the activity, not on the technology itself. That means that competition law should continue to apply in blockchain the same as it does today. Also, corporations have certain expectations of technologies, service providers, and transaction structure, and their legal, compliance, and regulatory experts know what they're looking for. So corporations will continue to use technology that satisfies their internal requirements and duties to their stakeholders. That really means, said a little bit more directly, regulation in place today combined with current business practices are sufficient for the transition of corporations onto blockchain. And the result of that will be the competition, or the corporations will use permission blockchain that offers privacy and settlement finality. Now, when it comes to individuals, there are fewer resources for them to understand what instruments they're transacting in, which is why there are disclosure requirements in place today with regard to certain instruments already. They also can't understand what technology they're transacting on, so there should be disclosure requirements there so that they can understand clearly what it means to be using a certain technology, especially where actors are anonymous, transactions are not final, or liabilities are not assigned, and therefore recourse is at times non-existent. We ask that the Parliament encourage government to learn about blockchain and to educate their procurement personnel to allow new technologies to enter into the public sector space. There's a lot of education going on in the private sector. So we strongly believe that should be done in the public sector as well, as blockchain can very much benefit the public sector. And in a new world where digital services are the new norm, it's even more important for governments to be using technology. So in the UK, we've gone to great efforts to become a fintech hub. R3 has its largest office in the UK, so it is of central importance to us. And we really want to be maximizing the rewards that fintech companies can bring to the UK. And that is all for me.
Isabelle, thank you very much. I think one of the really kind of interesting things you said there was around regulate the activity, not the technology. I think for some politicians that sounds a very interesting concept and how to take forward with blockchain, and to see the actual physical activity rather than technology itself, because sometimes they see there's kind of a cloud of technology in front of them and they can't see by it. So thank you very much. We've already got questions coming in, but we are going to wait till the end. Do ask if you have a question to use the Q&A facility that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. That may differentiate depending on what you're using to watch us this evening or this morning or wherever you are. And I'm going to go straight to Jens Lund-Nielsen, Head of Global Trade at Supply Chain at the IOTA Foundation. Focuses on partnerships and business ventures that improve international trade processes, and also about integrating a distributed ledger technology into the global supply chain with partners and with governments. So Jens, over to you, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you all for this opportunity. So when we talk about governance, it's absolutely a fundamental thing, as also said by the former speaker, Isabelle. And we also divide and think about governance on 3 levels. So the first level that I want to talk about is really the protocol level, the fundamental protocol or software that governs the IOTA network. And here, the way that we are built is that this protocol layer is an open source layer. That means that everybody can access it, everybody can review it. And it started as an open source in a community, developed by a community all the way back in 2013. Then in 2017, the IOTA Foundation was established around this to take initiative and support the development of this source code. As a foundation, we are also governed by different entities, mostly by the German law, where we are non-for-profit and we have a specific purpose to do research and development on DLT. Of course, we have our own governing board and supervisory board as a foundation, but we also have research councils, different university professors that brings knowledge into how the protocol is built. And all this is put back into the open source technology. A lot of the protocol, the discussions of developments and fixes and new setup in the code is transparently discussed on Discord channels where we have thousands of users around us who is part of both developing the software with us, but also they do a lot of the community testing about new ideas, new software and so forth. And to allow this protocol actually to be governed in a fully open source, we are moving towards the object management group, which is an international foundation that is expert in governing software standards. So we're putting the governance of the protocol over under their setup. The next layer is not the source itself or the code itself, but actually the network that applies this on nodes. How are these actors on the nodes, who are they and who is allowed to run the nodes? And here we defined as permissionless. That means that everybody can run a node, everybody can access the protocol and run it on their own hardware. We are hardware agnostic. You can run it on all types of hardware, even smaller smart sensors and devices. We are seeing companies starting to implement the protocol on. And there's something that distinguishes us, and we don't call ourselves a blockchain. We are distributed ledger technology because the underlying protocol is different. One of the reasons for that is that we don't have miners. Everybody is participating in the protocol with the same incentive, and that is to have the protocol running, be able to put out transactions, and then everybody is contributing to making those transactions, confirm these transactions. So we have aligned incentive among all users, which is a huge advantage, and therefore there are no fees on the use of it. That being said, when we start to talk about how is that protocol used and what is used for, it can be used for anything. I mean, you can basically think about it as what we provide is a fundamental distributed ledger technology that has the core features and capabilities like data immutability, the fact that you can then search and find data. You have tokens for value transfer if you need that for your business models. You have permissions and privacy around data through encryption. So permissionless doesn't mean that you can see the data that's out there because everybody can run it. It just means everybody is allowed to run a node and participate in the underlying network. But you have encryption on top of that that allows you to do privacy and permission setting of data management. So that is the transaction layer we've fundamentally developed, but we want to be part of enabling all the different use cases and all the different companies on top of that. So we are part of standardization bodies. We're part of the Eclipse Foundation and the Digital Twin Consortium, which is then governed by their members, which is a huge amount of different companies and institutions. And there we have working group that runs to set up standards on what is a digital twin, how do we define a digital twin. By having an agreed standard of that, that means that even different industry players in the different companies will have the same way of approaching this if they decide on some level to, in some stage, maybe to start to share information on the distributed ledger. The same around identity. How do you build a decentralized identity? We're putting that governance of that's how you build these fundamental building blocks into the Eclipse Foundation. And the same for distributed or decentralized marketplaces, which I know was also one of the questions that the APPG was asking for around this introduction here. So having governance or an agreement around what does it mean to be a decentralized marketplace? What are the rules around that, even though everybody can use the underlying protocols and put any data and data standard in there, it's good to have industry agreed standards. So that's the second level. The third level, which is really the one that most people are focusing on, I would say, is the business models or the applications, the use of these features that blockchain and distributed ledgers develop. And really the business logic, the how you want to build your application is something that we don't get involved in. It's up, the business logic is up to the consortium to make those rules and standards and design the applications using the features of immutability and tokens and privacy and so on, but to build their own business logic, to build their own revenue models, if that is applicable, and how the application is owned, if you want to be a smaller consortium, a larger consortium. Or you can also, and this is one of the things permissionless allows for, is that you can allow people to continue own their own data organizations, participate in different applications, but they can move some of that data, if they own it, into other applications. And that's the permissionless nature of that you can move between applications with your data. We are participating in different consortiums on this level to give our input, like we are with the APPG here, but also in APPA, which is the International Alliance of Trusted Blockchain Applications, which we were co-founding with the co-founding member with the EC, the European Commission, like MOBI, which is especially for mobility sector, because we think it's important to have these discussions also on government and use of what type of technologies and give our input on the application layer. But fundamentally, we don't build solutions. We built what we would call the trusted layer just on top of the internet and then allows business to build. If we talk about recommendations for governments, if you think about it, especially the decentralized marketplaces, and you have these capabilities that everybody can access the distributed ledger and start to share information. One of the most fundamental issues that is not sorted out yet is giving both people, but even more so, I think, to many use cases, also organizations, an identity, a distributed identity, or the identity that they can prove themselves who they are when they put the data out in different consortiums. And governments are traditionally one of the institutions that provide that credential as a starting point. And I think this is one of the places that government should be involved in, making sure that these credentials are given to different organizations as a starting point, that they exist with the tax authorities and so on, and they can prove that when they participate in all sorts of applications or business models or consortiums that allow, and that will allow for this permissionless environment where everybody can participate because they can prove themselves from the beginning, and it's not owned by a consortium for a consortium to set up access to the governance of an application. And this is the same logic that maybe when public services start to be developed, that you can imagine solutions where you have public service offerings that companies or individuals would like to take with them and use in other applications. So you gotta make sure that the public service is built for that kind of permissionless innovation. So it's not a number of companies or entities that kind of own the infrastructure and allow that to monopolize those kind of services. So this is the few words from my side. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Jens. And again, it does kind of raise some challenges for those of us in the public, the delivery of public services. I choose those words specifically. I don't know about the rest of the UK, but in Scotland we had a serious policy document called the Christie Report, which talks about public service reform, about the whole gambit of delivering public service as just opposed to the specific public sector. And I think in some of the issues you raised in distributed ledger technology in terms of governance, it'd be very interesting to find how the Estonians get over that hurdle in terms of their use of distributed ledger-like technology. But with that, we're going to move on to Marta, who joins us from Hyperledger, and we're delighted that you're joining us. Serves as Director of Ecosystems at Hyperledger. Evangelizes, I'm led to believe, that technology and open source, and passionate about how blockchain technology can help in non-traditional spaces. And Hyperledger is a leader on private or permissioned networks. So Marta, over to you.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure to participate in the APPG meetings. As you mentioned, Hyperledger is a nonprofit. We are hosted by the Linux Foundation. And the aim of Hyperledger really is to bring participants from different industries, from different groups of interest to collaborate and build business blockchain distributed ledger technologies. So Hyperledger does not have developers and staff. We do not in any way contribute to the code. The code is developed by the community. We are there to support that community. And we do have a policy of all are welcome here, which means that not only do we say, please use our code if you want to, we don't need to know about it, but also if you want to contribute, everybody's welcome to contribute. Everybody's welcome to participate in the special interest group meetings and the working groups, or all sort of public-facing meetings. There are very few things that are limited to the members of Hyperledger when it comes to participation. From that perspective, it's quite interesting for us, and with respect to what other people have been saying here, there are a lot of levels on which we can talk about governance. And there is the governance in terms of protocol layer, so how the different DLTs realize their governance models. How do you have nodes set up? How people, how you know, the technology process of creating a peer-to-peer distributed ledger network. That I don't want to focus that much about, also because it's specific to every technology. And in Hyperledger, we really do believe that there is no one ultimate distributed ledger technology, not one ultimate blockchain. It would be hard for us to actually have that position, given that we have 6 different DLTs and in total 16 different projects. It would be like picking our favorite kid. there's no doubt that the technology still holds a great potential, distributed ledger technology. We are able to reimagine corporate and enterprise operations. We are able to reimagine the way that the development and maturation is contingent on. And among other things, we are able to establish a strong, transparent, and accountable governance model. And there are many questions when you create an enterprise consortium or any kind of consortium when you have competitive parties or not necessarily parties that have their goals aligned but need to participate in the same network, that they will start asking, what do I get? How do I join? How can I have an impact? And what is the cost of joining versus what do I get? Still, when we form consortia, these are very kind of self-centered questions. Every participant wants to get the most out of a network, doesn't really see how there's no kind of social thinking or group thinking in any way. And there are loads of problems with today's governance, especially in consortium. More or less, most of them have some kind of a proof of stake, I would say, governance, which means that basically big companies overtake the small ones. If you have, and we've seen those situations quite a few times already, where a big company will create a big consortium and nobody wants to join it because small companies, be it in supply chain or in pharma, they're afraid of being overtaken by the big companies. There is, from the research that I've been doing, and I'm part of the IEEE standardization group, I've been looking a lot. Alastria is a close collaborative of ours as well. There is no focus on on-chain governance when it comes to permissioned networks. No matter if these are public permissioned or private permissioned network, there is still boardroom thinking. Permissionless network, absolutely yes. There is an ultimate goal of having every kind of removing humans ultimately from everything. In permission networks, unfortunately, there is a lot of legacy thinking. And from all the interviews I've been doing with people, Ligon's team will never allow for on-chain governance, automated governance. The other thing is that we don't have best practices. There is no copy-paste when it comes to blockchain governance. Different goals, different needs, define different governance model. So that is why we don't have standards around it. Enterprises still think that regulated and trusted central authorities are best positioned to play a leading role in introducing the governance principles and uniform standards. So we still say, we want it distributed, but here are the smart people that will figure it all out for us. And it happens over and over again. I know of consortia that have been created in order to with the distributed governance model in mind, and very quickly they gave up because participants were kind of waiting for the leading body to define the standards, to define the rules, accept and reject nodes, and so on and so forth. It is incredibly important to establish a secure technology infrastructure and best practices to support distributed ledger implementations at a very early stage of innovation cycle, rather than allowing different firms to put in place inefficient and hodgepodge processes. This will help to safeguard the safety and soundness of the network of all participants. It is useful to think about the scope and context of permission DLTs as well. And the governance really defines, there's very good white paper that has been published by some of our members, DTCC and Accenture, and they define governance in this model of defining the participants' life cycle, the runtime operations, the data governance, and third-party management that then leads to platform management and infrastructure, and then the legal and finance aspects. And my timer went off, so I guess I'm out of time. I would highly recommend to everybody that is interested in this topic to explore the World Economic Forum framework that has been released about a month and a half ago, which talks all about governance. It's a brilliant thing. You don't have to agree with the toolkit. You don't have to follow it, but it is a very good thought for thinking about governance in terms of bigger business consortia. Thank you.
Marta, thank you very much indeed, and a lot for us to think around there about the processes of governance. And I think from a political perspective, it's making sure that politicians and policymakers understand the role of governance in this type of technology. And I think that's going to be a challenge in itself. Given that time is now against us, I'm delighted to welcome Dante Disparte, who's Head of Policy and Communications at Libra. Is the Vice Chair and Head of Policy and Communications for Libra Association, co-author Global Risk, Agility and Decision Making, and recognised as one of the 40 leaders under 40, lucky person, by the Washington Business Journal. Libra Association, I think many of you will know, try to enable a simple global payment system and financial infrastructure. This is going to be interesting, Dante, so the floor is yours. And well, thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you so much, Martin. It's a real great pleasure to join everyone in this virtual session. And I think to contextualize some of my my remarks and thoughts on governance, I think the crisis should not be forgotten. The fact that the technology stands between us and this session today, this type of gathering would not be possible. And when you cast your eyes across a range of issues in both the public and private sectors, whether it's something as simple as casting a vote, or as complex as having the concept of a self-sovereign identity, the power of blockchain technology was really meant to stride right in this very domain and the very type of crisis we're facing today. And so when you describe all of these issues, and then you look at what is the mission and vision that motivates the Libra Association, we could do virtually so much with technology, but for the fact that the transfer of value remains very elusive, so much so that there's more than 1 billion people around the world who have no access to the formal economy or the banking system. And so true to form, and I think very much echoing the remarks of the earlier speakers, this is where the concepts around consortia come into play, and the concepts around how to govern blockchain technology really becomes the difference maker. Not unlike the internet, where blockchain has been likened to a foundational technology, invariably the technology itself has to begin fading to the background for it to be completely deployable and scaled to a manner that really becomes meaningful for people and for different types of institutions in the economy. Candidly, I think this has yet to be achieved in no small measure because we're partly still in a standards war on which blockchain is fit for purpose and what type of governance structures are fit for purpose for those blockchains. So in the case of the Libra Association, we have established a model that empowers every member of the association with similar voting rights and similar power. This is a little counterintuitive, as you might imagine, in particular when you think about projects that have been incubated at large technology companies. Oftentimes, the model historically is to ask for forgiveness rather than permission. But because what we're trying to do operates in such a heavily regulated domain of the financial services sector, we're really trying to flip that model on its head and establish a regulatory regime for the project that protects consumers and so on and so forth. And so really one of the major difference makers is in fact the governance model itself. So a concept of one member, one vote, and to have a diversified group of members that can contribute to all facets of the project. Critically, among them, you have groups like social impact organizations like Kiva and Women's World Banking and Heifer International, among others, that are helping the organization stay true to its mission on financial inclusion and promoting responsible financial services innovation. So that's a core constituency in the governance. And another aspect of this is that the project, of course, is also open source, which I think is a pattern we've heard so far in each of the earlier presentations. And the goal there is to really enable a thousand flowers blooming phase, if you will. And I think that's true of a lot of early blockchain projects, is this concept of driving greater innovation. And that's where this, blockchain as a challenger technology to try to bring new thinking and new approaches to different traditional industries and sectors you do have to enable the technology to be used and leveraged at the base, if you will, of the pyramid. So the Libra blockchain is very much focused on enabling a developer community. And since it was originally announced June 18th of last year, the technology has also been open source in no small measure because we believe there's a need for great innovation around the challenges of payments and extending the perimeter of the formal economy to a range of others. And then I suppose, in terms of recommendations, the Libra project, of course, has in no small measure invigorated a conversation around the world around the utility of things like central bank digital currencies, how stable coins can be leveraged as a means of payment and really truly inherit the stability of the underlying assets that protect them. And then ultimately, how do you empower people to have user-directed, peer-to-peer, high-trust payments? This is something that remains very elusive. And yet again, today is the International Day for Family Remittances, according to the UN. And yet to send money overseas is a very costly, slow proposition for billions of people. And in the midst of this type of financial crisis, we do really have a case right in front of us of how do you create a more urgent need for innovation around these issues. So in terms of recommendations to be considered, not really since the earliest days of the internet is there a wave of technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship looking for regulatory certainty. At stake for the countries that allow for this technology to thrive and the developers to find a home and the investment capital to find a home, I think are hundreds of billions of dollars of economic activity. Not to mention, of course, the empowerment of new business models and people who in no small measure remain, in some respects, stranded assets or stranded opportunities in the global economy. So I think model that Isabelle outlined at the outset of this concept of technology neutral based regulation is really vitally important. For a product of the type of scale that the Libra Association represents, needless to say, we continue to work in a multi-stakeholder manner to try to drive a consensus-based approach to regulating this type of project. But then with it, of course, the underlying technologies that underpin it. But over time, my hope and my sincere expectation is that the technology will fade to the background and governance will be the major difference maker. I think much as we've seen with any good crisis, including the one we're in right now, how we make decisions, how we are imposing value systems when we're called upon, I think those are the major difference makers right now. And the same would hold true with governing blockchain technologies. So with that, I will give back some time. I know there's probably a number of questions folks want to ask, and once again, grateful for the opportunity. Well,
thank you, Dante, indeed, for that. And we do have a range of questions coming up in our Q&A session, and know that we will be a wee bit tight for time, but maybe give a little bit over the other side of the half hour. Our first question is from Gavin Stevenson. He wants to know, does the panelists think that the interactions between, say, central government, local government, and service users, stroke providers, are sufficiently understood to define governance models using nodes, observation, etc.? And is any work underway to understand this nationally? Anyone want to kick off for that, even international examples?
Sure, I'm happy to provide a response to that. So I think the simple answer is yes, absolutely. In terms of doing this work, defining governance models, first, you just need to know who the parties on the networks are or should be, and what the business process is or what you want it to be. And then from there, you determine the behaviors that you want to permit and what you want to prohibit. And to the extent that those are already established because you're moving an existing process onto blockchain, you really already have a lot of definition around those pieces. We're working with governments globally to deploy networks within a government, as well as between or amongst governments. So from federal to state to local, and also between governments in different countries. And then also governments facing the private sector. So in something like procurement, that's where you have the public sector and the private sector actually meeting on one network. Another layer to that, just to add to this observer piece, is I mentioned observers as a function on a network. regulators, governments all over the world can play that function on networks where they belong. It doesn't make sense to have a securities regulator, overseeing welfare payments, for example, but rather the securities regulator can oversee equities markets. So it's not that every regulator belongs on every network, but certainly most networks do have a place for the regulator to play the observer node.
Thank you, Isabelle. And does anyone else want to come in that before I go to the next question? Jens.
Yeah, I think I'm happy to give an example as well. I'll take a very concrete example. We work in an East African country to help them develop the cross-border trade system, which includes a number of governmental institutions who have to share the data for trade certificates. And the key thing is that the ledger only provides the transaction layer. The data stays in these institutions. So, they still have their own ability to keep that data and govern that data. They only use the ledger, you would say, as a transaction layer and to prove through the hash, but not the data itself. That is the original data. In that way, many of the rules that govern their interactions, they can just continue with those regulations and those rules. It's more when you get to the international level of how do we secure, let's say, a trade certificate for that government? Is that recognized by Dutch government or UK government in the way that they trust that this, they know when it's a paper stamp and a very expensive copy paper that's different to copy. We have standards for how that is shared, and the customs on the other side can understand that. But we don't have those standards for hashes and certifying documents. And I think this is where there's something on the international level you need to develop.
That's great. Thank you very much. I know, Petko, you were only maybe coming for a question as well.
Thank you, Martin. Petko Karamodzic of Industrial Tech and Advisory Board member. I have two questions, one for Isabelle and the other for Dante. I think, Isabelle, during an event organized by Bank of England back in March this year, there was a question raised: who should be involved in providing the CBDC system, the central bank digital currency system, including user-facing services, which obviously requires a different form of governance? Just the Bank of England, 90% of the respondents said yes. 69% of the respondents said the Bank of England alongside the private sector. And only 12% answered just the private sector, which means that if a distributed ledger technology is to be deployed for the banking sector of the UK, it should be governed by the Bank of England and the private sector all together. So my question to you is, what sort of challenges do you expect from such form of operation? And the second question is for Dante. Obviously, you've changed your Libra white paper from 1.0 to 2.0. What are the lessons, Dante, that you've learned about the governance in particular? And I do remember Isabelle speaking in a podcast about how well Archie worked with the regulators. Did Libra learn its lesson to work well with regulators, just like Archie? Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you, Petko. So to the conversation about CBDC and the challenges there, I think that CBDC is actually a great topic for this venue because it's actually probably one of the first places in blockchain, in crypto, where we did see public-private collaboration. So back in the very beginning of 2016, we started working with the Bank of Canada and Payments Canada on CBDC. And since then, we've certainly advanced our work significantly. And most recently, earlier this year, we started working with the Riksbank and Accenture putting the e-krona on Ledger. So that's a retail solution, which is another exciting development. I think that it's broadly viewed, and our one of our co-founders, Todd McDonald, just wrote a blog about this, that public-private partnerships are really how this develops CBDC, and I would say more broadly, GovTech. You know, government is in the business of making policy, regulators are in the business of regulating, and companies like ours are in the business of technology for them to use. So it's up to us to build it and facilitate the technical part, and it's up to them to determine the governance and the policy decisions around that.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Petko, for the question. You know, adding to Isabelle's remarks, completely agree about the opportunities of public-private partnerships. And then to your question about lessons learned and, you know, the revisions to the Libra white paper, is that, you know, I think true to form of a project like ours that has, you know, one, ambitions to serve people that are currently unserved by the financial systems. This question of a learning journey and the last 12 months really having contributed quite substantively to the design of the project, to the positioning of the project, increasingly as a payment system, and very much so a payment system that is being designed to serve billions of people that are on the margins. To get this right, you need to have complete equilibrium between governance, the regulatory interest, public license, and then of course, the interests of the stakeholders that contribute to the project. So the last 12 months have been really nothing short of a learning journey.
I just wanted to add to what Isabelle was saying. It is interesting, the CBDCs are a very big topic in Hyperledger as well. In fact, one of the first CBDCs that is actually in production is out of all places in Cambodia. And it was, again, a very private collaboration between Suramitsu and the Central Bank of Cambodia, because they saw a very big issue with significant majority of the people in Cambodia not having access to bank accounts, not being able to pay in any digital form, but they did have access to mobile devices. And the project has been running for over a year now. They haven't been advertising it much, but still, I think something like 40% of citizens have started using the Bakong, which is the CBDC, and it's going pretty well. So I think that moving forward, key to to success will be collaboration. You know, the fact that you're inviting us here as the industry experts to talk about it shows that the UK government wants to do something similar.
Thank you. I'm not going to speak on behalf of the United Kingdom government, I have to say, and that might be a rather difficult discussion for them and for me. But I certainly think, you know, it's room for discussion and debate from a policy perspective. And before I'm going to take the privilege of being the chair and ask my own question, I'm going to go to one from Walid Al-Sakif. What are your views with regarding to self-sovereign IDs? You have Sovereign, for example, which is having a go at it. Do you believe it will come from governments, or will it be forced by the private sector who will push for it across industries, e.g. CU Ledger? Anyone want to pick up on that one? Marta.
Seems like I have a run here. I am happy to talk about this self-sovereign identities. I've been involved with ID 2020, and obviously Sovereign is a member of Hyperledger, as well as Hyperledger India is the basis for what they are doing. So we are staying very close to it. I think that the whole name, self-sovereign identity, somehow implies that it's against the sovereigns, against the governments. And I've always been very against using that name. I'm not sure that we have a better name, but we do need to understand that self-sovereign identity is about citizens or users participating in the collaboration in business and governments in a way that protects their private data. But it has nothing to do with me being an anarchist or, you know, liking this or that government. And I think that it will be vitally important. I am observing more and more companies actually not wanting to take the responsibility for storing private data, because the breaches lead to massive suits and massive problems later on. So I am hopeful. I'm not sure that you know, the sovereign's way or whatever UPort's way is the best one, but I think that it will be driven by the collaboration between companies that don't want to store private data, and governments that also not necessarily want to have the same legacy processes that they have. And last thing that I will leave you with is that the government of British Columbia has actually implemented an VON network, which is a virtual organization network, where you can go right now to von.ba.ca, I believe, or bc.ca, and you can look up any company. It's all running on a Hyperledger Indy, and see the provenance, the history, and know whom you're dealing with. So definitely it's of interest to governments.
Does anyone want to come in there quickly before we start to kind of sum up today?
Maybe just to add on that, to take it from a business perspective and not from the individual perspective, I see there's a big push actually in the private sector to have these identities working and set standards around these, because companies understand this is an enabler. What I think government can do is they can accelerate it, but they don't necessarily develop it. But having credentials that says, you know, you are registered with tax authorities or something like that would allow, especially when you trade internationally, to have some trusted way to prove who you are international trade. I was part of an exercise some years ago where we asked smaller businesses in Africa, what do they spend time on when they trade? And they spent 33% of their time actually just trusting if the other side was a trusted entity, and if they were registered, and having those, instead of sovereign identity, maybe portable identities where you can show your credentials is something that will be very, very powerful.
Indeed, and I'm going to take this. Sorry, Isabelle, you want to come in there briefly? Yeah.
Oh, sure. I was just going to add quickly that I agree with that perspective, the idea that the private sector is also pushing for this. Identity is something that will be solved one way or another. If the government doesn't do it, the private sector will do it. It can also be solved kind of network by network. So when you're permissioning someone onto your network, as long as the people on the network agree that the checks on the identity are sufficient, then that identity is sufficient for that network. And kind of zooming out from there, you know, we as a company are involved with Sovereign, we're involved with ID 2020, and we're talking kind of at this company level, but I think really the conversation needs to be more focused on technology. You know, people talk about R3 as being a consortium. We're actually a software company. Consortium days are over. Now we're talking about the platforms. That's where this conversation is, and what's built on top of those, which are the networks and the apps. So I think those terms kind of help frame what the conversation is. And when we say identity, what identity are we talking about? Where is it going to be used? It has to be software somehow, but it doesn't have to be the same across the board.
Thank you. And I'm maybe just going to throw this one in for a kind of final question before we start to round up tonight, because Isabelle, you mentioned there the platforms and software and the kind of strength and value of platforms as, you know, they kind of evolve in the market. And there are many politicians who think that the platforms are starting to challenge the state, and that the state itself could be challenged by the idea of these very large platforms, transactional, dealing with billions of people. I mean, Dante, you'd been mentioning how Libra around, you know, looking to reach all these billions of, as we would say in Scotland, folk, good folk. And, you know, there is, in terms of a policy and a political perspective, how do you qualify that possible approach, whereas we in the political side see our duty and our role to a physical citizen to ensure good governance of areas that our citizens and our electors believe require good corporate governance and also regulation. You know, because I'm speaking from the home of Adam Smith, and I don't believe I'm about to take his name in vain, but even Adam Smith ended his life as a tax collector and believed in regulation. It wasn't a free-for-all. So the challenge for me as a politician is to ask, where does the challenge to the state or do you believe there's a challenge to the state system? And how can we all work together to make sure that physical citizens still see a value in what we're trying to achieve in terms of the technology and also in terms of the outcomes for, I would hope, a better, more sustainable planet? Sorry if it's a bit kind of full on there, but you know,
yeah,
we need to do that sometime.
Martin, if I may, maybe just provide a little bit of commentary on that. I think first, we must think of the internet as a disruptive technology and blockchain as an augmenting technology. And I think a lot of the examples of the successes and failures over the last 11 years bear this out, that you know, the technology has been going through this rapid prototyping phase. And the reason we're having a discussion about governance is because there's an increasing need from all stakeholders to have parties that are ultimately accountable, whether that accountability is in a distributed nature or by a single entity like R3 or others. I think that's been what we have been rationalizing with blockchain over the last 11 years. And so the question to governments is not one of, will this disrupt me? And will the crypto utopian or the crypto anarchy visions that may have been touted by this sector in the past ever become realized? The better question is for governments and other stakeholders to look at themselves in the mirror and ask, where has my operating model reached a point of diminishing returns? The inability of citizens to engage, but for the advent of things like citizen wallets, the concepts of 1 billion people on the planet with no form of identity that we just discussed a moment ago, the concept of more than 1.7 billion with no form of formal access to the global economy or payment systems. All of these are challenges which, of course, blockchain alone is not a panacea. But what I think is most motivating about this sector is the fact that oftentimes you're forming these uncommon coalitions to build models that can then lay down groundwork so that the governance, the technology, the regulation, the protections, and all of the other aspects are in place where service doesn't come at the expense of status quo. So I don't see this as a challenger to the government space. I actually see it as a way of augmenting the types of goals that the public sector would like to see.
I mean, I agree with Dante's view that blockchain is very much an augmenting technology, and we as a company and as a software builder are building a tool for the government's use, not, and of course the private sector as well, but not as a replacement to the government, right? We are very conscious of that divide.
Yeah, I only kind of try and using these questions to stimulate debate, because there is often a question politicians are asked around how blockchain or distributed ledger technology can assist in improving, for example, voting. And my answer to that is, yeah, sure, it can work, but you can't force people to press a button, whether it's in a on a phone or on your laptop. You've got to give them something to vote for. So the technology is merely a vehicle for change, and it's up to us as governments to both challenge ourselves, to learn more, to be more engaged and more informed about the technology. Before we kind of wind up, I'm just going to ask Birgitte if you have any kind of final comments at all, Birgitte?
Yeah, well, we need to remember that the all-party parliamentary group is about bringing evidence in to Parliament, so they know how to vote, when to vote for policy and regulation around this. Yeah, so today is the first kind of governance meeting of several, and I'm just looking at how major agenda that will be. We've been talking about blockchain governance. Is about network governance, application governance, platform governance. We discussed public versus private sector on how they mess. We have talked about decentralization and centralization, peer-to-peer. Something we kind of have agreed on is the technology really is at the background and the governance is at the foreground, and we need to regulate the activity and less so the technology. We also discussed digital twins and rules around new marketplace developments, and also this whole issue of to what extent we are, this aspect of GovTech or public services, how that needs to be changing. I know from previous meetings that is a big challenge, because we're clearly public procurement rules from the Cabinet Office and HMRC is really
tough to deal with. So I know that when they change, they will be looking at how this new landscape is going to be. So this is a major aspect, because I'm sure we could have another meeting on. So lots of areas. So I think it's been an extraordinary meeting, and I can see that I look forward to watch it back, and we'll be writing up the report, and it will all be shared, and you can all watch it again and again. And we will be bringing it also forward to the people. It will be shared and circulated in Parliament and with the regulators and the government departments. So yeah, so fantastic. I really enjoyed tonight.
Well, thank you, Birgitte, Chief Executive, of course, of the Big Innovation Centre, and to all of your team for all the work that you've done to bring our guests together here tonight, and to thank them also for participating and informing us and taking part in our debate. To all of those who have been watching and who have been able to ask questions, apologies for those questions we haven't read out. If we can get answers to you, we will indeed. And also to the advisory board for joining us this evening. And again, just to say thank you very much, and hopefully you all stay safe. We're still going through a very difficult time across the globe, and our thoughts and prayers, as always, are for those who are on the front line fighting COVID-19. So thank you all very much indeed, and we'll hopefully see you all very soon. Thank you.